The wide receiver start sits. This is where things get really interesting. I'm looking forward at some of these names. First, we got Curtis Samuel. He's been a pinball lately, bouncing all over the place. What do we do with him against the Minnesota Vikings? A pretty good matchup. I think Teddy Bridgewater will be back this week. Last week, they actually did the little bait and switch. They released the actives and inactives, and they said Teddy's active. About a minute later, they said, no. He's inactive, and we saw P.J. Walker. I do think Teddy is going to play, but keep an eye on it throughout the rest of the week. Again, we're recording this on Wednesday. Curtis Samuel against the Vikings, who have been beatable. What are you doing?
You can plug him in as an upside shot. You know, you look around at other receivers in the league. I'll keep using Jacoby Myers as one because he's a guy that's kind of emerged lately with a high floor. If I just, let's say my team's super top heavy. I'll give you an example. I'm in a league where I have nothing for RB2, nothing for tight end. And if I'm going against one of the better teams in our league, I'm going to need some upside. That's where I'd plug Curtis Samuel in. The matchup is great. Minnesota has been absolutely abysmal against wide receivers. And Carolina's defense isn't stopping anybody either. Dalvin Cook should have an absolute field day against the Panthers here in Week 12. So with all that being said, I think I am willing to plug Curtis Samuel in with some degree of confidence. I'm putting him in over Mike Williams. I'm putting him in over Jerry Jeudy. Would you start Curtis Samuel over Michael Pittman?
Oh, wow, that one's tough.
I know. And here's the thing. With P.J. Walker, I actually don't think that affects that much of the fantasy value. It sucks for the Panthers because he's going to throw a little bit more interceptions. He's not going to throw as many touchdowns.
We saw a productive game last week with P.J. Walker.
Great.
It's been regardless whether it's P.J. Walker or Teddy Bridgewater. We've seen in good matchups, Curtis Samuel can produce. So you're absolutely right there. Curtis Samuel over the last 5 weeks is the wide receiver 5, Stef.
Wow.
How absurd is that? Oh, that's actually in standard. Let me look at the PPR filter. Curtis Samuel over the last 5 weeks, wide receiver 6, averaging 18 fantasy points per game. So I think he's a start, and based on that, I'm going to fire him up over Michael Pittman. We say it time and time again here. Sometimes when you get someone that's hot, you have to start them until they prove you wrong. We've done it with Chase Claypool, and he's turned into an every week starter. We did it with Travis Fulgham there for a while. He got you about 4 or 5 good weeks before the wheels came off. With Curtis Samuel, 3 great performances, had 1 down week, but bounces back with another good performance and a good matchup against Minnesota. I'm starting Curtis Samuel this week.
I don't know why Matt Rule hates DJ Moore, but looks like Curtis Samuel's taking over.
DJ Moore's putting up numbers too. He's like the wide receiver 13 on the season, which I don't know how the Panthers have 3 productive wide receivers and a productive running back in the passing game, and Teddy Bridgewater hasn't thrown for 9,000 yards. So, Steph, let's move on to a guy we just mentioned, Travis Fulgham. The matchup is beautiful against the Seattle Seahawks. I know that defense tightened up last week against the Cardinals on Thursday night, but Travis Fulgham and Jalen Reagor, let's talk about both Eagles guys. Would you start either of them in this matchup? And if you had to start one or the other between Reagor and Fulgham, which one would you pick?
The thing about Travis Fulgham is that he should be an absolute smash play.
Snaps are there.
96% of snaps against Cleveland, 7 targets. The week before that, played 89% of snaps against the Giants, 5 targets. Both games he had 1 reception for 8 yards.
It's crazy.
And they play Seattle this week, dead last in every single category. In terms, their defense is historically bad. I would almost expect some regression to occur with them, unless they're just going to be a historically bad defense for the rest of time. With that being said, if I have to start Fulgham, I will. I would rather start Reagor over him, to be honest. Because
really?
I think I would, because he's getting really the same targets. Maybe he's not on the field quite as often. I'll have to look.
93% of snaps, 87% of snaps last 2 weeks for Reagor. So it seems like Fulgham and Reagor are essentially their 2 full-time wide receivers. So after looking at that, Reagor 7 targets and 5 targets, more productive with those targets. We know, Fulgham's flash talent, but we know Reagor has that talent with his draft capital.
Exactly.
So I think I'm with you there. I'm going Reagor over Fulgham, but
I think you can start both.
I think you can start Fulgham, but you probably don't want to after what he's done to you. I'm fine leaving him on the bench, but you can start both, and I'm with you. I would actually go Jalen Reagor over Travis Fulgham.
And the real killer for both of these guys
is Carson Wentz.
It's also Dallas Goedert, who's come back and is now soaking up all that production. But the Seattle matchup, you're starting pretty much any receiver. You can start a name like Cole Beasley against Seattle, and he's going to produce for you just with how bad their defense is and how good their offense is. So I expect this game to be a Sunday Night Football shootout. Actually, might be wrong there. It's Monday Night Football.
Ooh.
I think that'll be a fun one to watch. I think Seattle's going to absolutely dominate in this one. But who knows? We've seen some surprising things happen in those games before. You hate to see this for Fulgham because he's still getting the volume. But I think these guys are really more in a 1A, 1B situation as opposed to one clear starter. Both guys have had the same target volume. It's just that Reagor's done a little bit more with it. And we know who he is. He has the draft capital, whereas Fulgham's a guy that we see it with undrafted free agents all the time, is that the team is more likely to move away from him because they're not committed with the capital. So that's where the concern comes in, where maybe they're tentative to make Fulgham a staple of this offense.
The thing is, the snaps tell me otherwise. And I did this with Marvin Jones earlier in the year. I actually was holding on for dear life, and I kind of got lucky with Kenny Golladay missing some time. But when Marvin Jones was left for dead, I left him on my bench because the snaps were there. He was playing 90+% of snaps. We know he has a rapport with Matt Stafford. I'm thinking to myself, if he's on the field, he's going to get the targets to go his way. He's going to get the production to go his way. Now, with Golladay being out, it certainly helps. It's a situation earlier in the year where we saw someone struggle and come back to productivity, and now this is kind of the flip side, but I think he could get back to that productivity, but I'd like to wait and see. Steph, let's move over to another interesting wide receiver situation. You talked about 1A, 1B in Philly. This is like a 1A, 1B, 1C in Tampa Bay.
It's crazy.
I think you're starting Godwin and Mike Evans every week at this point, and I think you're also starting Antonio Brown every week at this point, coming off a 8-catch for 57-yard performance on 13 targets. Tom Brady loves this guy. He only played 62% of snaps in this game, but he was hyper-productive when he was on the field. Now, the yards per catch is a little bit low, but Brady looked his way a ton. And I think in a matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs, where Brady could have 40, 50 pass attempts, Antonio Brown could be a lock for 8 to 10 targets in this game. And 8 to 10 targets for Antonio Brown from Tom Brady is something you don't want to leave on the bench.
Yeah, even had that one really deep bomb that could have been a home run hit that just went off the fingertips for AB, knocks a little bit more of the rust off. This was his third game back after not playing football in a year and a half. Like, let's cut this guy some slack. We saw the same thing with Gronk when he came into this offense. Hadn't played in a long time. Takes a couple games to get the rust off there, really get moving. But to see 13 targets, extremely encouraging, and has been on the field a lot when they're in these boat race game scripts against Kansas City in Week 12. That should be an absolute smash. Fire up AB in your flex spot. And would he be a guy for you that you'd be willing to buy low?
I guess if there is someone in your league who has AB and the production hasn't been there from a fantasy points perspective, because you look at his fantasy points, 6, 13, 13. They're not killing you, but he's not putting up these huge performances. If someone's willing to sell, I think you should go grab him. But the thing is, 1, trade deadlines are past. 2, the name value is going to make that really hard for someone like Antonio Brown. But having said that, I think he's a must start this week and coming out of their bye in Week 13. I think moving forward against Minnesota, Atlanta, and Detroit to close out the season.
Lovely matchups.
Steph, let's move on to a rookie, Ceedee Lamb. We finally saw him with his backup quarterback, Andy Dalton. But it's a big upgrade from Ben DiNucci and Garrett Gilbert. We saw Ceedee Lamb have a very nice game against the Minnesota Vikings, potentially had the catch of the week.
That was insane.
Incredible touchdown catch.
Went full Matrix mode.
He absolutely did. He was dodging, some bullets in slow motion with that one. 66% of snaps in this game, only 6 targets, 4 catches, 34 yards, and the touchdown. Got a few rushing attempts as well. Also returns punts if your league contributes some points for punt return yards. I know one of ours does. Steph, I liked what I saw from Andy Dalton in this game. The Cowboys won the game. He seemed competent, got Amari Cooper the ball. He got Ceedee Lamb the ball. Dalton Schultz caught a touchdown. Zeke looked a little bit more productive. What are we doing with Ceedee Lamb this week against the Washington football team? Another turkey take here because this is a Thanksgiving Day game. But are you flexing him against Washington?
I'd love not to. And the reason why is because of the matchup. I think the Cowboys are going to have a tough time with that Washington front seven. We just saw what they did, granted, at Cincinnati, but they just destroyed Cincinnati and took Joe Burrow out for the rest of the year. I think they're going to have some struggles, and they have a tough matchup in Week 13 against Baltimore. So I'm trying to sit Ceedee Lamb for the next 2 weeks. We know the talent's there. He's shown it. He's for a lot of people, the dynasty wide receiver 1. I think he's creeping up into my top 5. The way he's able to produce regardless of the situation around him, then we have to start looking at him like a Terry McLaurin type guy where no matter what, he's going to produce, even if it's on limited volume. We saw the touchdown in this game, which was great to see. They do have Cincinnati in Week 14, some other nicer matchups down the stretch. So he's a guy that's in flex consideration for me. I'll take him over a guy like Travis Fulgham.
He's got a high
rest of
floor.
season.
Yeah, he's got a high floor. It all depends on what you're looking for. I think the floor is there. I don't think he's someone against Washington with Andy Dalton who's going to go for, watch him do this now, 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. But I think you can rely on him for 5-6 targets. He has a pretty high catch rate. He's dynamic with the ball in his hands. They involve him with rushing attempts, with punt returns. You know, he's actually been hyper productive in the red zone, which I didn't expect coming into the year. His touchdown numbers are higher than I thought. He's got several this season. Let's see, he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, which is not bad through his first 10 career games.
And he's sitting as a wide receiver 2 right now. Even with the ups and downs that the Cowboys have had, he's sitting as the wide receiver 23 on the year.
You can start him, but there are better options. We just talked about Antonio Brown. There's my wife's league. She's actually deciding between AB and Ceedee Lamb in that flex spot. I said Antonio Brown, so I'm going to say it on here too. I like Antonio Brown in that volume he's going to get against Kansas City more than Ceedee Lamb, which is a lower volume play, hoping for some of that efficiency. But Steph, last guy on our list at the wide receiver spot, Josh Reynolds. This has been an interesting case. Right when you feel like you can trust the guy, he just rips the rug out from under you. They're playing the San Francisco 49ers this week. Jared Goff, huge game last week.
A pretty tough matchup.
Yeah, Jared Goff last week against Tampa Bay, throwing the ball 51 times, 39 of 51, 376 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Had the couple interceptions, which weren't great, but this was a game plan thing. Sean McVay said the Tampa Bay Buccaneers stopped the run, so we're going to pass. If there's a team that can stop the pass, they're going to run. San Francisco is middle of the pack in both. What do we think that's going to mean for Josh Reynolds, who is clearly still the number 3 option on this team? There was a lot of blasphemy out there about him overtaking Cooper Kupp.
Spicy takes were out there.
As that number 2 wide receiver, but he's clearly the number 3. What are you doing with Reynolds against San Francisco?
He is the reason we put him on the show sheet is just because if you're in a absolute desperation, let's say you're in a 14-team, maybe even a 16-team league.
91% of snaps.
That's the thing.
Week.
The snaps, like he's out there running around. Yeah, maybe a lot of those are just he's running 16 wind sprints a game and not really looking around for the ball, but he's out there. And to your point earlier, talking about if they're on the field, they're more likely to be productive. That's what we're seeing with Josh Reynolds, who's had, multiple games with over 80% of snaps. A couple here with over 90, had 91% of snaps against Tampa Bay. So I think he is matchup dependent. He'll be a very interesting option against teams like Arizona, against the Jets, against Seattle in Week 16. I think he's a deep league stash that you can put on the back of your roster, build up some depth. If you absolutely need to start him, you can. In a 12 or a 10-team league, I'm looking the other way just because there's other guys.
I agree. He's kind of in, I hate to say this, but he's kind of in Nelson Aguilar territory. 2 very different players. I think Aguilar is much more boom or bust in terms of touchdowns, but he's that guy. I picked up Aguilar in our league because you look at his production. Yes, he's going to have his down weeks, but he's getting snaps. He's getting a fair amount of targets, and if he can turn that into, last week he had 2 weeks ago, 8 for 94, really productive game. Aguilar has had several touchdowns this year, several 20-point performances, kind of in that same tier. Someone you don't love to start, someone you're not excited to start, but someone you certainly can in a good matchup who's getting snaps for their team. So, yeah, Josh Reynolds is playing more than Cooper Kupp right now in terms of snaps.
It's crazy.
But this Sean McVay offense is much more scripted than a lot of other offenses. You see teams like the Packers, Aaron Rodgers, they script up plays to all their different weapons, but you see them improvise a lot. You see Kyler Murray improvise a lot, Deshaun Watson. Sean McVay draws up plays and draws up schemes to get players the ball. We see Cooper Kupp get, 70 some odd percent of snaps, and he's getting 15, 16 targets a game over a couple of the last few weeks.
And you'll see a guy like it'll just be a Tyler Higbee game one
Exactly.
week.
You see them feature the tight end because they know they want to exploit the weakness of the defense. We saw it with Robert Woods as well. When these guys are on the field, they facilitate touches for their playmakers. Josh Reynolds is a great player, and he will get a couple plays actually scripted for him in games, but it's not going to be as often as your Robert Woods. It's not going to be as often as Cooper Kupp, and you do throw Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee as well with some scripted plays and all 3 of the running backs. So Josh Reynolds is more of a really good blocker, someone who is out there running routes, but he's usually going to be the number 2 or the number 3 read, which is why sometimes you can see high snaps with lower targets. But again, a good option to have on your bench. In the playoffs, these matchups are great with Arizona and even the New York Jets. If they just absolutely stomp them and the Seattle Seahawks, you can see some volume there.